domain. So welcome to Azure Static Web Apps from 0 to deployed in 60 minutes. But Swetugg gave me a challenge and it's now only 50 minutes and we're a couple of minutes late, so I'm gonna really go quickly through my intro so we can get to the fun stuff. But basically, sometime over the last year or two, I saw a wonderful tweet come across my timeline. And it was saying that if you are blogging and you're putting content out on the internet and you're putting it on somebody else's website, no matter how awesome that website is, you're using your time, your energy in order to build up that network and not your own. So why don't you get your own domain? It really resonated with me. It was like 10:30 at night. I was in bed reading this, but I grabbed the laptop and I brought a domain. I brought 3 domains, because seriously, who can stop at one? So I got stacy-clouds.com, .dev, and .net. And once I got those domains, I did absolutely nothing with them. Because, as I'm sure many of us know, buying a domain and using a domain, 2 entirely different hobbies. The thing that stopped me really carrying on was I didn't just want to deploy WordPress to my own domain and do whatever. I wanted to use this to practice stuff, to try new things. And I didn't have the time to do that, so I couldn't really get started. And that was until I started to play with both Blazor and Azure Static Web Apps. A really simple and cheap way to get some dynamic content out onto the web using Blazor WASM for the front end running inside the browser and using Azure Functions on the back end to get some dynamic data, to tell the world who I am. Hi, I'm Stacy Cashmore. I'm Tech Explorer DevOps at Omniplan, a financial advice software company based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I've been developing software since the middle of the 1990s, and for the last 3 years I am so honored and overjoyed to be able to say I'm a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. So that's it with the boring stuff. Let's get rid of the slides and actually get into doing something fun. So I have an empty Visual Studio right here, and what we're going to do is create our application so that we can get going. So if my mouse behaves, first thing that we're going to be doing is creating that Blazor application. So we're going to do a new project. And we want a Blazor WebAssembly app. I'm not using the empty project because I'm counting on having navigation built in order to be able to get this done inside of 50 minutes. So I want to call this client. I need to make sure that I run this in the right place because otherwise my GitHub repo is not going to work as it should do. So we're just going to set some things here. And then again for my GitHub repo, I've got to call the solution something quite specific. So we're just going to call that Blazor Talk Demo. Now I'm going to be running this in .NET 7 Preview. I have done this 2 times in practice since RC came out. One time it went swimmingly and one time I wanted to throw the laptop on the floor. So be aware in the first row, flying laptops possibility. I'm not going to add authentication to it just yet. We're going to add that later on manually. Obviously going to configure it for HTTPS, and everything else we're going to leave empty. Most important one is this, the ASP.NET Core hosted. I don't want to host this in .NET Core. I want those static files that I can throw out to my Azure Static Web App so that I can run it without actually having a web server in place. So we'll create this up and we'll see whether or not the laptop plays ball with working quickly. That's not bad. Next to our client application, we're also going to add an Azure function. And this one we're going to be calling API. So we have our client and API. These names are semi-important. We'll get to that in a few minutes. And for API, we're going to be using .NET 6. I'm not doing 7 for the .NET functions yet because I don't think the static web app is quite ready for that. We're not going to create an Azure function, so there's slightly less cleanup for us to do, and we're just going to leave everything as default. So now we have the project. Now, first thing I want to do is do some cleanup because there's an amount of stuff that comes in that just bugs me. I say I did want that router, but I don't want the other stuff in there. So we're going to get rid of the sample data. And we're going to get rid of the counter page. I'm really sorry for anybody who loves the counter and the fetch data page. They're gone. In the index razor itself, we're just going to get rid of the survey. Why don't we just go for the wonderful Swetugg is back. I'm super psyched to be here. I was supposed to be in Gothenburg about 24 months ago, but for some reason that got cancelled. So it's awesome to be here, even if a little late. And we're going to do Swetugg demo. Next, I want to do some cleanup on the main razor layout because we don't need the link to the documentation, and I want that space on the screen in a minute. And seeing as we've removed the counter and the fetch data, we're just going to get rid of the navigation for that. So if everything has gone good, let's delete the survey prompt too. We don't need that one either. If I've done everything right, this should now build and I can breathe. Yay! And now we can get on to actually adding stuff. We're going to start with the API. What I'm actually going to be doing with this application is going out to my dev.to account, because that's where I do most of my blogging. I'm going to get a list of my blog posts into my application, and I'm going to display that list on my page and allow people to click out and go to dev.to to read it. First step in putting myself on the internet on my own domain. To do that, we're going to need some models. So let's add a models folder to the API. And then we want to add a specific model in order to get our blog post summaries. So we're going to add a class. And now, because you don't want to spend 43 minutes watching me do typos, or maybe you do, don't worry, there's going to be some coming up. But I've got a load of code snippets I'm going to bring across, and I'm going to be walking them through with you. So this is our... Can we make this slightly better? Is that readable at the back, by the way, or does it need to be bigger? A little bit bigger. Better? Awesome. So we have a class here, and it's just going to get, as it says on the screen, the ID, title, description, URL, and the publish that date. I am using the JSON properties names here because dev.to has its own wonderful names that it wants to use, and I don't want those inside of my app. Now we have the model, we can actually add our Azure function in order to get that data. So we're going to add a new Azure function, just call it blog post. We want a HTTP trigger, I'm not bothering with OpenAPI yet. And again, we have some stuff to bring over. So our function, it runs underneath a HTTP GET, and it runs on the root of blog post. That's going to be API/blog-post. And what it's going to do is basically just 3 steps. It's going to get a HTTP client. It is then going to get the data from API articles on dev.to. And then it's going to deserialize that back into an IEnumerable of blog post summaries and throw it out for the client to use. I'm not injecting the HTTP client because, well, I want to do this as quickly as possible. I would probably do this slightly different in production. But basically, this is all that we need to do for our API to get this first step of data. So now we can start on the client. And the first step on the client is, again, another model so that we can read the data. In real life, I add this in a separate project that I can share between the two, and I get the data from dev.to slightly differently. But again, in a demo, that takes slightly too long to be able to run through it this quickly, so I apologize. Add another class. And this one again is going to be blog post summary because it's basically the same thing, and we'll bring some code across. Now this is slightly different because we don't need all of those JSON properties names because this is just reading from the API. I control this model, so I don't need to do anything special here. Next up, we're going to add a service so that we can read this data from the API and use it inside of our application. So I'm going to add another new folder. We're going to call this services, and I'm going to add a blog post summary service. a new class, blog post summary service. And this is quite a simple class. We inject a HTTP client, which we get out of the box inside of the Blazor WebAssembly scaffolded solution. And we're exposing a list of blog post summaries that can be null. We only have one function, this load summaries, and what we do is just say, do I have any summaries yet? And if I don't, I'll go out and get them. If I do have summaries, I'm just going to do nothing here because I want to make my application snappy. I don't want to have to reload this every time somebody comes to the page. Now that we have the service, we just need to make it usable inside of our components, and we're going to do that by adding the blog post summary service to our dependency injection. And now we can do the cool stuff on the page and actually make it do something that we can see. So we're going to add a new page. It's going to be a Razor component. And we have, again, just some data to bring across. So we're going to turn this component into a page by setting the page directive to blog posts. We are injecting that blog post summary service so that we can use it inside of the page. And when the summaries are null, we assume that we're loading something. We're going to assume nothing's gone wrong here. And we're just going to put on something to tell the user that, yeah, we're loading data. When we have data, we are just going to loop through those summaries, and we're going to put them on the page with the title, the date it was published, the description, and a href to click out in a new tab so that people can actually read the full blog post. And then finally at the bottom we have an uninitialized async, and this is when we load the component. When it's initialized, we're going to go to that service and we're going to say, hey, load my summaries for me, and the blog post will either load them or say, nah, I've already got them. We don't need to do that a second time. Last but not least, whilst I can tell people just to go to my website /blog-posts, the fact that I struggled to say that means that they're going to struggle to type it. So I want to give them an easy way to get there. So we're going to extend that menu again, just with a direct link back to my blog posts. And basically, that is my first step for the application, to get it ready to go out so that people can start to see my content under my URL. So what we're going to do now is push this out to my GitHub account, and then we're going to create the static web app itself. So we add app. We're going to commit everything push. Yeah, we'll do a pull then push. Why? Ooh, this is interesting. Did it do anything? It didn't do anything. Eek. Okay, what did I do wrong here? I'm on Blazor demo, I'm on main. Why are you not doing anything? Thank you. Why are you not pulling? Right, I'm going to cheat here. What I'm going to do is kill everything, pull it, and then try again. This is a problem when you do a run through the day before in the hotel room and you think you've cleaned everything up properly, but you've not. So let's do this one. We will open up another one. Sorry about this, people. Pull this to here. Always the way, isn't it? Let's see if we can do this by hand. Okay, let's do this in our third way. Git clone that to Swetugg. Then we're going to copy everything back again. Yeah, we'll replace the files, why not? And then we'll do git add star git commit m. I really do, thank you. This is what happens when you stress. Oh, come on. Thank you. And now, after that brief interlude, when we go into GitHub, we should please, yes, I've got data. Awesome. Thank you. So inside of Azure, I have my resource group created, and we're just going to add a new static web app to this. So I'm just going to search for static web app. We're going to create that. And then we're going to keep our fingers crossed for the rest of the talk. So we have subscription and resource group. These should be correct because I did it inside of the resource group, but I have seen some Azure resources have a bug and this doesn't work properly, so always double check. Then we're going to give it a name. Swetugg demo. Wonderful thing with the name for a static web app, anybody who's worked with app services or Azure functions, that name has to be unique inside of Azure because that also makes your URL. For a static web app, you get a random URL given to you, so this only has to be unique inside of your resource group. It can make your naming a little bit easier. Then we want to say where we want to run, and I'm based in the Netherlands normally, so West Europe works for me. And as it says on the screen, this is for the Azure functions, and it's for your staging environment. Your actual static code is globally distributed automatically for you, and you don't have to do anything with it. I adore Azure Static Web Apps. Then we're going to say where we're going to get our information from. This is another bit that's really cool for getting started. Out of the box, if you use GitHub or Azure DevOps, you get a CI/CD pipeline built for you. Doesn't mean that you have to use those, but if you do, you get this out of the box. If you use something different, you've just got to build it yourself. I'm based in GitHub, so let's get my repo. And I want to deploy the main branch, I hope. Then we need to say what we're going to be building. You can do a whole load of stuff inside of an Azure Static Web App. You have Angular, Blazor, Next, Nux, React, Svelte, Vue, Gatsby, Hugo, VuePress, and other, because as long as you're deploying a static file, you can deploy it using an Azure Static Web App. I'm doing Blazor, so that works. Then we just have to say where our code is. This is why I used client and API, because it just makes this nice and default for moving on in the future. You can put it anywhere you like, you just have to set this up correctly. And then we have our output location. If you're doing Blazor and you don't have a folder in your repo called www.root, leave it as is, it works out of the box. If you're using a Node JS type framework, so Angular or React, you do need to know where your code is deployed, but there are awesome documentation on the Microsoft site for this. So let's create this and hope that I named everything correctly. Static Web Apps, if I'm lucky, take like 2 to 3 seconds to actually create. They don't take that long, and there it is. So we now have this available. Here's that URL that I was talking about. So we have the orange desert, or is that dessert? I always get those two mixed up. Either one's good. If we open this up, we get your Azure Static Web App is live and waiting for your content. Because whilst the app itself is really quick, we've still got to put stuff in there, so it takes a little bit of time. And where does that come from? It comes from our GitHub action run. So we can see this one's been running now for 32 seconds. And that's going to take about 3.5 minutes to run. So rather than stand here and try and fill the time for that to get here, let's have a look at how we can run this locally. And for that, I've got to reopen my project. So let's come back to my command line. And let's open that up in preview again. On the wrong monitor, because of course, on the wrong monitor. So here we have our client again, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting. The static web app has an amount of wonderful glue inside of it, so it takes those static files, it takes your Azure functions, and it makes them look like one coherent application. I don't have that running on my machine. When they were first released, you had to do an awful lot of interesting code to make this work locally. But thankfully that's all changed. We now have the Azure Static Web Apps CLI. Has a lot of functionality, but what I'm going to be showing you today is how to run the application on your machine. So there's a couple of things that we need to do first. We need to set up our startup projects, because when I run this, I want to run both the API and the client. And I want to, how are we doing for time? Yeah, I'm kind of okay. So I want to make this run just so it's easier to type. So it used to be that everything came out of the box as HTTPS 5000 and HTTPS 5001. So that's now my muscle memory, and I want to keep that just for typing it in the demo. And the other one, and this one really annoys me, Azure Functions always used to come on 7071, and they changed that recently-ish inside the Visual Studio to give you a random port number. Awesome if you're doing multiple Azure Functions, annoying if you're doing a static web app. So we're just going to get rid of that one. Build everything, make sure that everything's saved, and then hit go. And we should get our Azure Functions running. Yeah. So there's our app. There's our Azure function on 7071. And if I click on blog post, I get an error because it doesn't know where the API is. So instead, we're going to come back to our terminal. And we're going to say static web app start HTTPS localhost 5000. What that's going to do, anything that comes into the app which isn't part of that glue of a static web app is going to be redirected to that localhost 5000. Anything which does come under that glue part is treated differently. So the API, for example, by default, and this is why it's annoying that they changed the default port of Azure Functions, by default it puts anything from API through to 7071 for you, so you don't even have to mention it in your command line. So we start that, we keep our fingers crossed that it comes up quickly, and there we have it. We have a new URL, localhost 4280. If I go back to my application here and go to 4280, we now get the Blazor app. The first time you run this, it's a little bit slow out of the box, and that comes from the Static Web Apps CLI, because it has to proxy everything, and sometimes it's quicker than this, sometimes it's slower than this. This is kind of in between. But we can see that we're getting all of the data, and you can see it's going from 4280 down to 5000. Come on, 50%. You can do better than this. Come on, little machine. What we should see when this loads is something that looks exactly the same as it did before on that localhost 5000. It's just when we click on the button to get the data, it should work and not go boom. Should. Always a fun word. Should. Yay! So we have our Swetugg demo. And we have our blog post. And there we go. A list of everything that I've got in my dev.to folder. When I click on it, we open it up, and like I say, that is my first step to getting something on the web. Using this, you can debug your API, you can debug the Blazor app, and debugging Blazor WASM is getting better and better all the time. It's almost, in my experience, on a par with actually debugging a standard ASP.NET application these days, as long as you use the right browser. You have the tunnel in between the browser and Visual Studio, so when you're running it, you need to do it, as I've done here, in the same browser that Visual Studio starts, because then you get that tunneling out of the box, and everything's a little bit easy. Hopefully now, my deploy might have finished. Hey, look at that, a green bar. And now, in our production environment, we have it loading a lot quicker than it did locally. We have our blog posts, and again, we can open these in a new window. So we have that now running in production CI/CD inside of about 30 minutes. Now we can make it do something even better. Now, my next step would be to actually get the blog posts themselves and display that inside of my application as well. But I also wanted to have a play with editing data inside of Blazor when I did this. But I don't want anybody else to edit my data. I only want to edit my data. It's bad enough when I do it. So the next step that I want to add is authentication inside of my app. And this is where static web apps, I think, just truly come into their own. I am not an authentication expert. We have somebody for that in the office, and they're awesome, and I'm really happy they deal with it. Inside of a static web app, it's also all done for you. They make this really easy. And I want to demonstrate this in this production application. You see me write it. I've got nothing in there for authentication yet, but if I go to .auth, another one of those glue folders inside of the Azure Static Web App, and I go to login, and I go to Twitter, it's going to go out to Twitter. It's going to authenticate with my Twitter account, ask me to give consent for the data, and then it comes back to my app, and I'm now authenticated. Nothing in the code to see it yet, but I am authenticated, and I'm going to prove that with you by going to another .auth page, which is .auth me. And here we have the data that you get from a static web app when you log in by default. We get a client principal. It has an identity provider. It's now Twitter because I logged in with Twitter. Out of the box at the moment, you can do AAD for Azure Active Directory, Twitter, GitHub, and Google, which I believe is in preview, but it works fine. And obviously, depending on which one you use, depends on what's set there. Next up, we have a user ID. And this is very specific to this static web app and this login. So I'm not doxing myself here. This doesn't go between different static web apps, and 10 minutes after I'm finished here, this won't exist anymore because I'll be cleaning up. But it's useful to know that you can't match user IDs between different apps when you're creating them. But I do get the user details. And this is my Twitter handle, Stacy_Cash. And obviously, if you need to, you can match this up between different things. Useful thing to remember here is this isn't always a handle. So I logged in with Twitter, so I get Stacy_Cash. If I'd have logged in with GitHub, I would have Stacy Cash because that's my GitHub handle. If I log in with Azure Active Directory, or if I log in with Google, I get my email address, which is why I didn't do that inside of the demonstration. So you need to make sure you know what data you're going to be expecting inside of these fields. Last but not least, our user roles. Every single user that signs into your application inside of a static web app gets 2 user roles as standard. Anonymous and authenticated. We can add more, and I'm going to be showing you how to do that in code. We'll see whether or not I show you how to actually add it to the static web app itself, but if I don't get there and you want to know, catch me later and I'll show you. So that's what we have available to us, and if we then, one last thing I want to show, go to logout, and then go back to that auth me. If you're not logged in, you just get a null here because it doesn't know who you are. So let's add this to our application now. Stop the running. I want to do a pull because I want to get that workflow file that's just been generated and not fight Git as I just did earlier. So we're going to start with the client application because how you add authentication to your client and your API are slightly different to each other. For the client application, first thing we need to do is add a NuGet package, and that's going to be ASP.NET Core Components Authorization, basically what you need for any ASP.NET application for authorization. Accept everything, because we never read those things, we just go for it. Do a bit of cleanup, so I've got spare tabs. I'm going to add a folder for authentication, and yet again I'm going to say, please don't do this if you're building it for real, put it in a separate library because it makes it so much simpler. We're going to add a new class, and that's going to be Static Web Apps Authentication State Provider, and then we're going to bring over a whole load of code to go through. So the class that we've just made, it inherits from the authentication state provider. This is what we need to inject inside of our DI container in order to get authentication to work. We're passing in a config file and a HTTP client, and we'll get to why we need the HTTP client in a second. And then we're overriding get authentication state async, and we're doing two things here. We're getting a client principal that we've just seen, and then we're going to turn that into a claims principal that we can use to fill an authentication state. Number one, get in that client principal. What we're going to do is make a request, HTTP request, to that auth me endpoint. We can do this because this is a Blazor WASM application. It's running in the browser. When we make the call, it's going to have all of the security headers that the Azure Static Web App sets, so we can trust the data that we get back from here to use inside of our app. We're going to try and deserialize the client principal. If it doesn't exist, we're just going to make a new empty one, and then we can continue. And then we're going to turn that from the client principal, which is what the Azure Static Web App uses, into a claims principal, which is what we need inside of our Blazor application. I strip out the anonymous role because I don't particularly care if someone's anonymous. I'm just going to treat them as if I don't know them, whether they're authenticated or not. And then we check, do you have any roles left, or was that it? If you don't have any roles left, I'm still going to treat you as unauthenticated and just return a new claims principal. If you do have roles left, then I'm going to make a new claims identity based on the identity provider of the client principal, adding a name identifier and a name claim type for the user ID and the user details, and finally just adding every single role that we get back from that client principal. Then we return a new claims principal based on that, and that's how we make the authentication state to pass back to our Blazor application. At the bottom, we just have some classes that we need to do just to deserialize that data. So we have authentication data, and that was a wrapper that we saw in the browser. The client principal with the identity provider, user ID, user details, user roles, and two new ones, claims and access tokens. You need these, well, you don't need these, but you can use these if you are using custom authentication. We are not going to reach that today, I'm afraid. But if you are running this in an enterprise environment, you have your own identity server or something, then you can add the extra data to your claims from the identity server and use that to set the roles inside of your application. So next up, we need to make sure that we can actually use this in our application. So we're going to add it to our dependencies. So we add to here, we add the authorization core, and then we just add in the authentication state provider based on that one that we just made. So now when we start the app, we know if we're logged in or not. Now we can use it in our components. First step, we need to add a using statement so that we can actually access that authorization. I don't want to put that in every single component that I'm making, so I'm going to add that to my _imports.razor page. I adore this file, and I was so pleased when we got implicit usings and global usings so I could make my C# files as clean as my Razor components. And last but not least, on the setup work, we need to add the authentication state to our router. So we're just going to wrap the router assembly in a cascading authentication state. And then because it bugs me when things aren't indented correctly, I'm just going to add that tab. So this will just make sure that we have an authentication state in every single component that we're using. We're going to use that in two components today. First component that we're going to use it in is our navigation, because I want to give people a login button. So inside of our components, we can use this authorized view, and this lets us know whether or not we're logged in or not logged in. I've done this as simply as possible. It simply says, are you authenticated? You can also add roles to this to give some role-based access control based on what you want in your application. Next up, we have, where's my scroll bar gone? For our authorized view, what we're going to do is make the navigation go to that logout page that we just saw, and just so that we can get something out of our security context, I'm just going to have a check to see, do you have the super user role? And if you do, we're going to tell you that you're a super user. Otherwise, we're just going to tell you that you're a standard user. And if you're not authorized, then we're just going to have a logging link that just goes to that Twitter logging. So we're just going to default it to Twitter for our users. Finally, we are going to change the main layout. I said I wanted that part of the page, not the main layout, the index page. There's main layout. Where's that gone? Ah, here. I said I wanted that space that's normally given to the link to the ASP.NET documentation, and I'm just going to add a little something here just to say how we're logged in. So what is the authentication type that we're using, that Twitter, GitHub, AAD, or Google? If we're not logged in, we'll just say not logged in. To get the client working, this is everything that we need to do. Basically, once you've got that state, authentication state, you just use it like any other authentication inside of Blazor. Next, we're going to be doing the API, and that works ever so slightly different. And to start the API, first up, I'm going to be adding a file to my client application, and I'm going to add that to the www root. And it's going to be a JSON file. So new item. Let's search for the JSON. Told you there'd be typos. And this is just going to be static web app config.json. And this is how you can control your static web app from within your code. Now this file does a lot more than I'm going to show you here, but we're just going to cover some basics right now. First one, nothing to do with authentication, but I want to add it. Navigation fallback. That blog post page that we saw doesn't exist on the server. If somebody hits F5, they're going to get a 404 error. Add in the navigation fallback is just going to tell the static web app to say, if you can't find this file, just return the context of index, and then Blazor's going to take care of the rest on the client side. We don't want to do that for images though, because that would be weird. Same for the CSS. And to be honest, I also like to add the API, because I'd rather just get a 404 from the API than invalid content because it's displaying my website. Then we have the root. Inside of here, what I am hopefully going to show you, if there's time, is how we can protect our API endpoints. Because rather than putting the code to protect the endpoints in the functions themselves, we can put it in this file and the static web app will take care of it for us. It's less code I have to write, it's less bugs I'm going to make. So we're going to add two endpoints. We're going to have an auth test, and only super users are going to be able to add that. And we're going to have an auth test too, because naming's hard, and I just want to show you how to access it with an authenticated user. Finally, we have this status code 404. Those logins that I was talking about at the start, they are there for you out of the box. You do not control them. So I can't turn them on and off inside of the static web app. What I can do is, instead of turning them on and off, I can just simply say, if you go to this page, just give me a 404, and that is a de facto turning off of that authentication method. So if you don't want people to log in at all, you can put all of the auth stuff in here. If you just want to say, I only want people to access my site using Twitter because you've got some Twitter integrations, then you can just make sure they can only log in with that one type of social login. That's everything we're going to be putting in the client. Now let's do the API. For that one, we need to get access to our authentication information in a slightly different way. So we're going to add a class called Static Web App API Authentication. Now, the client, I said that you can get access using that auth.me endpoint. Obviously, we can't do this in the API because we don't have those security headers. It's not running in the browser. Thankfully, Microsoft takes care of us here. And anything which comes through that glue to get to your Azure functions gets this extra header, XMS client principal. And contained in here is exactly the same client principal that we're using on the client side. So we are just going to get the data from the header, if it exists, convert it from a base 64 string into an actual object, and then we're going to say, is that object null? If not, new client principal, you're not logged in. And if you are, then you have your client principal. And down here, we just got those same classes that we used in the client side. Like I say, if you're going to do this, put it in a separate library, it's much cleaner. Next, we're going to add our Azure functions to use this, and they're not going to do anything spectacular, they're just going to show us what data we get inside of that header. So we want a HTTP trigger. And again, it's just a HTTP GET. It's just going to run on the auth test endpoint. We get our client principal using that static web app authorization code that we've just seen. And then we just get some data out, put it back on the site just so that you can see it's running. And like I say, I want two of these because we've just seen two of them added to the static web app config. So I don't want this to be copy, I want this to be 2. And in here we just need to rename this to, of course. 1, 2, and I believe I've got one more place I need to do this. Just there. So now, assuming Git actually plays ball and lets me push this, add auth, this should get deployed automatically. Yes. Have a look inside of our GitHub repo, and we should see a new action added to add this auth. Like I say, CI/CD out of the box, you don't have to set it up. This is awesome for getting started. Important to know, you can override this. You're not limited to the cool stuff that comes out of the box. You can put your own entire flow in there. But if you don't want to do that, if you're just playing, practicing, getting started, it's simple like this. You don't need to worry about it. So now that's running, let's restart our application locally and see how we can debug our authentication. Now, I do need to restart my Azure Static Web Apps CLI. If you're just doing standard development, you don't need to do this. You can just leave this running in the back end, and you just restart your app as you want. Hot reload works through this as well. It's fairly awesome. But we added that static web app config JSON that's only read once. So if you change that, you do need to restart it. So let's run this one again. 5 minutes, this is going to be close, but it's now running. So if I come to my application and I start this in a new browser, 80. It loads much faster this time because it's already cached it. And if we go to API-auth test / not dot, we should get a 401 unauthorized. This is what we're expecting. This is good. If we go to 2, we still get a 401 unauthorized. This is still good. So let's change this. So if I load my app, I've got this login button. And when I click on it, I get this page. I don't go out to Twitter because Azure Static Web Apps have all of this set up and it's all fantastic. But my laptop's got no connection to Twitter in order to be able to do this authentication. But because it's all abstracted away for you, it doesn't matter. We can just fake it using the Static Web Apps CLI, and it will just return that client principal or give us that client principal header that we can use inside of our code. So let's give our user a name, Swetugg demo, log in, and now when we go to that auth test 2, we get access to our function and we see the data that we should have. This is what we wanted to see. If I go to auth test, I still get an unauthorized because I had that role, you've got to be a super user. So let's give ourselves that super user role. First we need to log out, then we can log back in again. And this is something I love about this way of cheating when you're doing this. If you need to play about with the roles that your user has, you can just simply add them to the user roles here. I really like the idea of, if you're working in a group for this, rather than having to have a user set up in every single one of these social providers, each having different roles, each having different setup, we can just do this on the fly in our browser. We can share the user ID between each other. We're not sharing username and passwords anymore. I think that makes a really nice developer loop to share stuff between the team. So if I log in now, hopefully we should see super user in the menu. And that should also mean that when we come out to auth test, we see data. So using this way, we can do all of the same debugging and working locally as we would do normally, just without having to worry about that external stuff. How's the deploy going? Show you this in production. It's finished, yay! So if we now come back to the app, we now have, if we log in, and I'm going to log in using my Twitter user, I'm not going to be able to show you how to set the roles, unfortunately, because I don't want to steal time from Jimmy. But like I say, can speak to me later if you want to see. I won't delete this just yet. I'll keep it on the machine for the rest of the day. I'll delete it tonight if anybody wants to find me. Now that we're logged in as a standard user, we can go to that API/auth test 2, and we get the information as we expect it to see. So it's working as you want. When we go to auth test, we get a forbidden. This is important to know about that Static Web Apps CLI. I really wanted to show this bit. It pretends that you have an Azure Static Web App on your laptop. What you actually have is a Node.js server really pretending to be that, and it isn't 100% the same as an Azure Static Web App itself. This is one of them. If you run this locally, we've got a 401 unauthorized still. Running it in production, you get the correct 403 forbidden because we're authenticated, but we don't have the right access roles. And there we are. It's a very fast fly-through. But in about 40 minutes, we've created the app, we've created the API, we've got the data from that external source, we've seen how to put it online and how to add authentication and run it locally. Next steps, like I say, make it look pretty because I'm using the standard Blazor layout here, add proper content to it, and then the world's your oyster from then on. If you think this is cool, I want to give it a try, scan the QR code that will take you to the Microsoft documentation for this. If you didn't, then still scan it because there's some awesome documentation on MS Learn. And just to purely plug for myself, I've written a book on this which should be released at the end of this month. So if you want to try the demos I've been doing here, you can go through it yourself in that book. Sorry, Jimmy, I stole 2 minutes of your time, but thank you everybody for listening and enjoy the rest of the conference.